You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, welcome to Indications. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot, Senior Economist at the Conference Board. Today we'll be discussing what we think will be COVID-19's biggest legacy, the massive shift to remote work. After nearly a year of primarily working from home, a growing share of organizations expect remote work to become the new normal for many of their workers. But within the shift to remote work, no one story fits all. There are large variations in remote work rates across demographics, occupations, industries, and geographies that have become even more apparent during the pandemic. The rise of remote work will also have an important impact on economic activity and business operations. It will drive workers' decisions about where they live and choose to spend their money, and it will have major implications for worker productivity and for how organizations hire, how they lead, and on their culture. Joining me for this discussion is Gad Levanon, head of our Labor Markets Institute and a regular contributor in Forbes. For close to a decade, he has also been writing about remote work trends and their labor market implications. I'm also joined by Frank Steemers, senior economist at the Conference Board, focusing on U.S. and global labor markets and most recently on the rise of remote work. Gad and Frank, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Gad, perhaps you can help me put this in context as to why we think remote work is going to be the pandemic's biggest legacy. What incentives are there for organizations to make remote work the new normal?
Well, it certainly seems that many employers and corporations jumped on the remote work bandwagon. I think the main reason is that in the last 9-10 months, when many of them worked mostly remotely, they kind of perceived remote work not hurting productivity and maybe even improving it. And they also understand that by hiring remotely, you're increasing the labor pool, you can cut cost on office space and also cut labor cost by hiring in less expensive labor market. So there seems to be a lot of good reasons for why to do it. And as I think we'll talk about later, there are surveys that show that there is a very strong increase in the intention to let people work remotely. But I think one of the most important question is, do we have enough evidence that remote work really works? I think the evidence that we're seeing now, solid productivity that companies report, we have to remember that it's not just the shift to remote work that happened in the last 10 months. It's also a major economic crisis, and it could be that the stronger productivity that we're seeing is because we are in an economic crisis where kind of all hands on deck and people are more efficient and work harder. But I think that the question of whether remote work works in normal times, when there's no pandemic and no economic crisis, I think that question is far from settled. And I think we all need to be aware that there is a scenario that in the next decade or so, companies that rely more on remote work will underperform. I don't know if it's the most likely scenario, but it's still a scenario. And if that's the case, we may see a lot of reversal in those trends. But the reason, in addition to the impact on how we work, I think there is also the issue or the overall impact that the shift to remote work is going to change a lot of other things in the US economy. People will live in different places as a result and spend money in different places than they were before the recession, before the pandemic. So the impact is much larger than on just how we work.
So Frank, now moving on to you, how many workers were working remotely before the pandemic? How many during, and how many do we expect to continue to do so afterward?
Right. I think right before the pandemic, I would say roughly speaking 5 to 7% of full-time employees in the office and professional occupations were working from home. Since the early 2000s, we have seen a gradual increase, but of course, since the outbreak of COVID-19, a lot of people are working from home, still the large majority. Of course, some people have returned. But I think the big question now is how many workers will continue to work from home even after COVID-19 has or disappeared or is not as much as a risk anymore as it is right now. I think a lot of people have the expectation that it will be much higher. We actually also ourselves, we asked in one of our HR surveys to 330 human capital leaders what their expectations were. And what we found is that now actually 1 in 3 organizations expects that after COVID-19, 40% or more of their workforce will be primarily working from home. So that is a huge percentage. So I think there we can clearly see that there will be a very big increase compared to how it was before the pandemic. So in terms of workers, I think we shouldn't be surprised if we see that something between 20 to 40% of US workers will be working primarily from home after the pandemic.
Yeah, that's certainly a huge jump. And now I really want to dig in a little bit deeper, Frank, into who has been able to work from home during the pandemic and the likelihood that they're going to continue to do so. What industries and occupations have seen the highest rates of remote work, and who is least likely to return to the office?
So I think it is, of course, least likely for some workers to return to the office. Also very dependent on in which region they are living. And I think Kat will talk more about that, because in some parts of the countries we see that workers are still working from home. Just focusing on occupations, I think clearly tech-related jobs will have one of the highest shares of remote workers. We also see it in finance and insurance. These were also the two groups that already before the COVID-19 pandemic had already higher shares of remote workers. Engineering positions, there we see that there has been a big shift to remote work and not many have returned yet to the workplace. Another group I want to point out is office and admin occupations. So especially before the pandemic, very few were working from home. We think that this may have to do with many of them being hourly workers. And then a lot of employees got into trouble if they had to work overtime. You couldn't check if this was happening, or for maybe some legal reasons. But now since the pandemic, we see that also many of these barriers have been broken. So also going forward after COVID-19, we also expect higher shares for these types of occupations. So that in terms of occupations, just industries, I think it is not too surprising. It's of course in finance, insurance, we will see higher rates of remote work, internet publishing, but maybe also some specific manufacturing industries. In our analysis, we found, for example, chemical manufacturing or transportation equipment manufacturing, where remote work rates will likely be a bit higher compared to other industries. And of course, where it will be low, that there are many of the industries where working from home for many of these works is just not an option. So think of transportation, warehousing, construction. Although we shouldn't forget that also in these industries, there are also professional office workers. So I think everywhere we will be seeing an increase in remote work.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally what we have been seeing, right? There's a huge push for remote work economy-wide, and it's interesting to hear about those surprise, manufacturing industries that might see that increase in remote work as well. And Kat, I noted at the top of the program that there are large variations in remote work across not only industries and occupations, but also across demographics, especially by race, gender, educational attainment. Can you describe some of these variations across the different demographic groups?
Sure. Yes. So it all relies on the occupation and industry composition by race. So we know that Black and Hispanic workers are much more concentrated in jobs that don't require a bachelor degree, more in the blue collar and manual services jobs, where the ability to work remotely is close to impossible. That's why they are in general much less likely to benefit from that shift to remote work. And as there is a kind of an racial wage gap and income gap, now we will see another gap opening up, and that's the gap in the ability to work from home.
Yeah, and another group that we've seen that has been working from home much more is women. During the pandemic, about a quarter of women worked from home compared to just 19% of men. And this was women, especially that had young school-aged children, were even more likely to work from home. So it's not just childcare that is the reason why. So I'm going to steal Frank's thunder a little bit because this was his regression analysis, but his study found that women are more likely to work from home than men, even after accounting for other factors like the industry they're working in, their occupation, and their level of education. So obviously a lot of women do choose to work from home. Like myself, I have 2 small kids and I've been working from home for years because it gives us the flexibility to both work, to stay in the labor market, and to meet our family and household obligations. But one thing that's interesting about this pandemic is that it has removed the stigma of working from home, but it might not be that great equalizer for women that it's chalked up to be, especially as organizations decide to pursue a hybrid return to the office. So where some workers may choose to work mostly in the office while others will continue to work primarily from home, it may lead to persistent opportunity gaps. So for example, in promotions, if face time is important and more men choose to go back to the office than women, that may lead to that disparity in opportunity. So it's something for employers to be aware of as we move back into a remote working world. So those disparities are important to keep in mind. Gat, I understand also that there are differences in remote work across geographies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are huge differences in remote work rates across geographies, and there are several factors that are in play here. One is that we find that workers that live outside metro areas, so that's mostly small cities and towns or rural areas, they are much less likely to work remotely. Within metro areas, in metro areas that where the average commute time is longer, we see much higher rates of remote work. Of course, the benefit of working remotely is larger when the commute time is longer. Also, in metro areas that commuters are more likely to use public transportation, in those metro areas, the share of remote work is higher, partly because the risk of infection is higher when you use public transportation. There's also a very interesting variation that is related to politics and policy. So not surprisingly, workers in states that had more restrictive social distancing policies, they are more likely to work from home because they're more likely to be in areas where offices were shut down. But perhaps most interestingly is even after we kind of take into account all the factors that we mentioned, we find that in blue states or democratic leaning states, there was much higher share of remote work than in red states. And I think, unfortunately, the personal reactions to the pandemic in the US were very much impacted by politics in 2020, and that impact, how fast people kind of return to their office versus stayed at home. Now, those changes, even though they were very much impacted by the pandemic, could have long-lasting effects, because if you worked from home for a year or a year and a half and you kind of got used to it, you're more likely to continue to want to work from home versus someone who immediately got back to the office after April. So I think some of those changes are likely to remain in the long run as well.
Right. Frank, let's shift the discussion a little bit from who is working from home remotely to how organizations are going to deal with this new way of working and what it means for workers. So first, for organizations, how is remote work going to change the way they hire?
Yeah, so of course, Elizabeth, with this shift to remote work, this also means that a lot of operations and a lot of ways how companies were used to work are also going to change. So one of them is, of course, recruitment. if people don't have to come into the office anymore, you don't have to hire any more people that live close to the office. So you can expand your talent pool, basically. So we actually asked, again in our human capital survey, this question, and we were hoping to find out how willing HR leaders were to hire full-time employees who would be working predominantly from home. And what we found is that before the pandemic, I think 40% of companies were actually open to have remote workers, but only if they could occasionally commute into the office. So half of the companies was not open to remote workers at all. And since the pandemic, we see a clear change there. Now almost 9 in 10 companies are saying that they're open to some form of remote working or remote hiring, where still 50% prefers this hybrid model, that people can still occasionally commute into the office. But now we see that already 1 in 4 companies is fine having their employees anywhere in the US. And even 10% is open to have employees anywhere in the world. So there you see that there is going to be a very clear shift from hiring closer to the office to hiring much more broadly around the US or even globally.
Yeah, and I think one other key takeaway on that recruitment factor is that working from home used to be a perk, right? And now it's really part of everyday business. And so to the extent that employees are going to be looking for friendly work from home policies, it really puts a lot of pressure on employers to ramp those up and make sure that they work with the way that employees want to work moving forward. So another aspect about work from home is, productivity. And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. And whether employers choose to stick with remote work, I think a lot has to do with how productive their teleworkers are. And several studies, including one from Stanford University, another from Upwork, and even our own survey of employers, indicate that work from home has gone much better than expected for both workers and employers. And while many organizations do report increases in productivity, again, from our own surveys, it does seem that self-reported productivity increases could just reflect the fact that many remote workers are working longer hours. But in general, research has shown that remote work can have both a positive and a negative impact on productivity. So on the plus side, remote work can raise productivity by increasing job satisfaction, improving work-life balance, shortening commute times, but it also can decrease productivity through greater isolation, hidden overtime, and too much blending of home and work life. So ultimately, there seems to be this teleworking sweet spot of about 1 to 3 days a week, according to a researcher, Nicholas Bloom at Stanford. And this sweet spot balances out the positive and negative productivity effects of remote work. So if we are thinking about moving into more normal times, and you want to work from home, you want to do it enough to take advantage of the fact that there are fewer distractions at home and you're able to do your laundry, but not so much that you're still able to join in-person collaboration sessions in the office and better manage those expectations with your supervisor. So there's really this optimal amount of time or frequency of work from home that seems to enhance productivity levels. So, Gad, let's switch gears again here and talk about the implications of remote work for workers. And what are some of the ways that remote work can change their quality of life?
Sure. I think there are 2 main ways that remote work will improve the quality of life for many Americans. One is it will reduce commute time. So, for too many Americans, the commute is a daily living hell. Before the pandemic, it was very common for people to commute for more than 2 hours every day, and this is likely to be significantly lower now. And the second is because of the willingness of employer to allow remote work, we will probably see millions of Americans moving to new houses in the coming decade. Before the pandemic, many households had to choose either they live close to the office in a small apartment or move far away from the office and have a larger home, but a terrible commute. And I think now more and more Americans will be able to have both a reasonable commute, meaning no commute in many days, and a much larger home. Also, especially those that are going to be 100% remote workers anywhere in the US, that will probably allow them to move to locations that better suit their desired lifestyle and preference. So all in all, I think this is a very positive development for most Americans.
Great. So ultimately, we know one thing is certain, right? That the rise of remote work is going to leave a lasting legacy, not only on our labor market, but on our economy more generally and the way people live their lives. So we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Gad and Frank, for such an insightful conversation.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Indications and other podcast series from the Conference Board through your favorite podcast app. Thank you again. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot with the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.